Armed with wings and some of the most powerful engines in the world, aircraft carriers are about to take off into the skies. They could become a new class of massive bombers or the largest cargo carriers in history. Or at the very least, a familiar sight that Marvel's S.H.I.E.L.D. marvels at. This isn't the first attempt at such a hybrid vessel, but it is as close as ever to success at building a massive vessel that can exploit both sea and air and truly introduce the US military to the best of both worlds. And this is all thanks to a slew of groundbreaking 21st century technologies. As far back as the 1920s, the US military set out to build flying aircraft carriers and in 2 cases even succeeded. USS Macon and USS Akron were 2 rigid airships from the time, built to serve as airships armed with 5 planes launched into the battlefield and recovered via a hook system that lowered them into the airstream. The firsts of their kind, these aircraft carriers had a bright future ahead of them until they were, on different occasions, faced with severe weather conditions and both fatally crashed. Almost a century has passed since these events. The US now has aircraft carriers that would stare severe weather storms in the face and cruise through them. And with renewed interest in flying aircraft, thanks to China's race to catch up to America's aircraft carrier dominance, the US Navy now has a slew of technologies that its flying aircraft carrier programs could employ to bring their airborne dreams to life, particularly the nuclear power plants. 2 Bechtel A-1B nuclear reactors power the USS Gerald Ford, the US Navy's latest and most advanced carrier. These nuclear reactors produce at least 484 megawatts of electricity. That's USS Ford for 25 years without stopping, and possibly enough electricity to thrust an aircraft carrier into the skies. This is one of the latest concepts of a catalog of attempts at flying aircraft carrier since the ill-fated airships. Between the airships and a Bechtel-powered carrier have been very interesting programs, all focused on developing the much-coveted flying aircraft carrier. At least 4 different flying aircraft carrier programs have gone through the US military, each one as interesting as the next. Here are those programs. Boeing 747 Airborne Aircraft Carrier. The 1970s came with the U.S. Air Force experimenting with the idea of converting one of its large aircraft into a flying aircraft carrier, full of parasite fighters that could be deployed and even recovered in mid-air. Among the contenders for this role were the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy and the Boeing 747. Boeing would take the lead when they correctly pointed out in their proposal that the 747 offered superior range and endurance when flying with a full payload of an impressive 883,000 pounds. The 747 would therefore be able to carry up to 10 microfighters at a time. The U.S. Navy is about to become the U.S. Air Force. Aircraft carriers are about to become aircraft. Like the aircraft that take off from them, these aircraft carriers would take off to the skies as opposed to the seas. But for the same reason, to project the might of the U.S. Navy in the brightest colors. Uncommon as the concept of a flying aircraft carrier is, it isn't a new project and has actually been around since the time of the World Wars. And now, thanks to the advent of technology, they have received renewed attention, and the U.S. is once again aiming for revolutionary flying carriers. Flying carriers gaining attention at this time could be owed in large part to the complete dominance of American sea-based aircraft carriers today. In fact, 25% of the world's aircraft carriers belong to the U.S., and their total deck space is more than double that of all other nations combined. In addition, the members of the lead USS Ford class of these aircraft carriers are far more lethal than every other aircraft carrier in history, and the following features prove that. Number 3. Nuclear power. 2 Bechtel A-1B nuclear reactors, the most cutting-edge engines created for use on water, power the USS Gerald Ford. As a result, the carrier would only need to be refueled once over its entire 50-year operational life, as these engines make use of the everlasting nature of nuclear energy. This means USS Ford can run for 25 years at a time without refueling. And with a peak speed of around 30 knots, the supercarrier can access every country on the planet just in time to pay friendly visits to allies and wreak havoc on enemies. Number 2. New sensors and processing systems. USS Ford features the latest sensors, processors, and weapons needed on an aircraft carrier to maintain that balance of intelligence and lethality. Unlike virtually every other aircraft carrier in the world, the USS Ford features a single system for both horizon and volume search in the form of the AN/SPY-3 multifunction radar for X and S-band active electronically scanned array. It remains the most advanced radar system from the US, with enough versatility to handle surveillance, air traffic control, missile communications, and spot targets from miles away. Number 1. American fighter jets and UAVs. Up to 75 fighter jets and unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, can call the USS Ford home at a time, including the Navy's favorite child, the 5th generation F-35C Lightning II Joint Strike Fighter, whose development program remains the most expensive weapons development program of the Pentagon to date, with a reported cost of $400 billion. The result of such an expensive program is a fighter that really can do it all: close air support, vertical takeoff and landing, and everything in between, cementing it as the modern go-to fighter for the Navy and every other department of the military. That is, until the 6th generation F/A-XX fighter takes center stage, of course. And for when that happens, the USS Ford is already equipped with the technologies required to host, launch, and recover it. All of these and many more combine to make the US undefeatable on the seas. And so an airborne version of them could make the US undefeatable in the skies, which remains an ultimate goal.
In August 1941, 3 lumbering Soviet bombers head towards Nazi Allied territory. But these are no ordinary bombers, because for years the Soviets have been secretly developing a new kind of weapon: flying aircraft carriers, designed to pierce through enemy lines to deploy a swarm of fighter planes and dive bombers. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. And with the Soviet Union's darkest hour approaching, these massive juggernauts are about to make history, because they're headed straight for enemy territory. By the 1930s, it was clear that aircraft would play an essential role in future conflicts. But there was a problem that had plagued aircraft designers from the very beginning. Large, heavy bombers could carry lots of fuel, so they could fly great distances. But fighter aircraft, which had to be light and agile, could carry only enough fuel to cover a short distance. This mismatch had consequences. While bombers could fly deep into enemy territory, their fighter escorts couldn't. And over hostile airspace, the bombers were often on their own. With only a handful of machine guns to fend off enemy fighters, they were vulnerable and suffered heavy losses. But in 1930, Soviet engineer Vladimir Vakhmistrov came up with a radical solution.
Actually, it's pretty straightforward. If you could have the bombers carry the fighters, they could be transported over great distances and deployed whenever they were needed.
At first, Vakhmistrov's idea fell on deaf ears. The Red Army was focused on strength through numbers, not gambling on unproven ideas. But Vakhmistrov pressed on.
Comrades, flying aircraft carriers have tremendous potential. The fighters could not only protect the bombers, they could be fitted with their own bombs to make precise strikes against more challenging targets. Or they could be carried far out to sea to attack naval fleets which would otherwise be out of range. The fighters could even clear the path for our bombers by destroying enemy anti-aircraft guns in advance or by blinding them with smoke screens, making accurate targeting impossible. Flying aircraft carriers could also patrol our borders, remaining airborne, ready to intercept enemy bombers before they made it anywhere near their targets.
The strategic benefits couldn't be ignored, not even by the Red Army. The platform for Vakhmistrov's aircraft carriers would be the mighty TB-1 and TB-3. As the largest bombers of their time, they had plenty of power to carry the fighters. But figuring out where to attach them was the tricky part. In the wrong spot, the fighters would interfere with the bombers' control, or airflow would make launching them impossible. And in an era before sophisticated wind tunnels, it would all have to be figured out through trial and error. Vakhmistrov would call his creation Zvano, and he would end up flight testing more than a dozen configurations. In some models, the fighters were mounted above the wings, in others, suspended below. One arrangement even saw 5 fighters carried at once. Remarkably, instead of weighing the bomber down, the fighters actually helped to boost their performance, because during flight the fighters would run their engines continuously, while drawing fuel from additional tanks fitted to the bomber. This brilliant setup allowed the bombers to fly faster, climb higher, and lift even more than they could have without the fighters attached. Launching the fighters was fairly straightforward. As long as the bomber was kept steady, any reasonably skilled pilot would manage. But reattaching to the carrier was another matter. On later versions, a trapeze-like system allowed pilots to dock with the carrier to take on more fuel. But docking was a skill that would take time to master. During flight, the fighters would communicate with the carrier using a telephone system, and a series of lights mounted in front of their gun sights would further signal commands.
Everyone was pleased with how Zveno flew, but on the ground, things were more challenging. To load the fighters over the wings, we'd need all the help we could get, calling over mechanics, ground controllers, and anyone else unfortunate enough to be at the airfield. We all wondered if we could ever get used to such a strenuous task. And then everything changed for the better when we were provided with a tractor. Of course, this happened only thanks to the Soviet Communist Party and the wisdom of our great leader, Comrade Joseph Stalin.
But the flying aircraft carrier concept was viable, and Vakhmistrov had laid the groundwork for something truly remarkable. Vakhmistrov envisioned building enormous airborne motherships capable of carrying more than 20 fighters. He also wanted to develop purpose-built fighters that wouldn't need heavy landing gear and could be built with smaller wings for greater speed and maneuverability. Of course, these ideas would have to wait until the Zveno carriers had proven useful to the Red Army. But after years of development, that turned out to be far more difficult than anticipated. Back in 1932, the Red Army seemed eager to accept the first version. But when new I-5 fighters became available, Vakhmistrov was ordered to modify his design. Then, when more powerful 4-engine TB3 bombers were introduced, Vakhmistrov was once again sent back to the drawing board. It was the same story when I-16 fighters became available. It wasn't until 1939, nearly a decade after the project started, that the Red Army finally accepted the carriers, with an order for 40 carriers equally divided amongst the Navy and Army. But by this point, some military planners were beginning to doubt the whole project. For one, the TB3 bomber was now obsolete. Next to a modern aircraft like the American B-17, the TB3 with its crude lines looked more like farm equipment, and there were doubts about whether the slow, lumbering bombers could still be effective in combat. Meanwhile, the situation in Europe was beginning to worry the Soviets. By 1940, Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe, and military planners feared that the Soviet Union was next. With war on the horizon, resources were shifted to the production of proven weapons. And it meant only 5 Zveno carriers were ever delivered, and even those were pulled from duty in the summer of 1940, dismantled and put into storage. It seemed like Vakhmistrov's efforts would amount to nothing. But the Soviet Union's darkest hour was approaching, and Zveno carriers were about to make history. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched a massive attack on the Soviet Union. Unprepared, Soviet defenses quickly crumbled. In the south, the Red Army scrambled to slow the advance towards the vital port cities of Odessa and Sevastopol by launching counterattacks on Nazi-allied Romania. A critical target for the Soviets was the King Carol I Bridge, as its destruction would cut a vital railway and oil pipeline and disrupt the flow of supplies to Romanian troops. For days, the Soviets tried to take out the bridge using conventional bombers. But each time, the bombers missed their targets and faced heavy resistance from anti-aircraft guns and enemy fighters. It was soon apparent that only precision dive bombers would have any chance of destroying the bridge. But the Soviet Union was critically short on capable dive bomber crews, and existing fighters lacked the range to reach the bridge. So the Red Army raced to pull the Zveno carriers from storage and bring them back to working order. Ordinarily, an I-16 fighter loaded up with nearly a third of its weight in bombs would have never made it off the runway.